a humanistic agnosticism, psychology of significance projection, and the reality of sacredness. Here's the outline. I'll first talk about explanation, especially to approach the problem of psychological experience from the perspective of psychiatry, existentialist psychiatry, along the Karl Jaspers tradition, not because I think it's a psychiatric condition, of course, it's not. It's just that I think it gives us some good ingredients to understand, especially on a religious exclusivism, that some experience do not indicate reality. And I'll talk about construction, how the constructivity through conventionality, how we could have some religious experience because of ritual and tradition being passed down, and projection, especially with regard to feeling. And the main thing about the talk here, how some how some feelings relate to significance in the correct way, some do not. And lastly, about comprehension, how we comprehend others, whether it's interreligious or even from the perspective of atheists, how one could make sense of religious experience. First of all, explanation, causality, causal explanation, especially in the philosophy of mind. We start with because if we want psychology to be a science, scientific, the empirical data that we collect, we hope that it's something that's observable. The observability of behavior assists us in investigating the mind, of course. But then, if we get down to the level of replicability, we may go all the way down to neuroscience, and with regard to psychiatry, the treatment would depend on the pharmacology, but that misses something, because of the intentionality of the mind, because of the content of beliefs, thoughts, or even the expressiveness of emotions. So beyond causality, we can also understand others' minds, assuming their rationality. And very simply put, when we understand someone rationally, if the person will produce verbal reports, they may testify to what they see, they will provide evidence that they have and give reason as to why they do a certain thing or believe a certain thing. But then there's the problem of experience because of its privacy. Some experience is not shared by everyone, and of course, each person has privileged access to one's own experience. That privacy would make sometimes understanding difficult, but at least given the experience that some report themselves to have, there's a difference between being reasonable and otherwise. And I think reasonableness and rationality comes apart, especially if rationality depends. It's a conception of rationality that uses affective conception of evidence, so that there are no, evidence has to be factive. So, but experience, it's it's another thing. So, on that note, construction and whether someone even some theologians, they talk about reasonable faith. They don't insist that they've proven the content of their faith. But if we can talk about reasonableness, then we can look at the issue in terms of how they describe their experience and how the conventions are in a certain religious tradition. But on that note, there's the dogmatism that I will presuppose, the epistemology that with which we can know something without knowing that we know. And even for the sacredness, different religion practitioner, they presuppose the reality of the sacred relative to their own religion. But they could have known that their sacred is real without knowing that they know, or even providing, especially without having the evidence that's publicly accessible to convince others. I think that's something very important that we have to bear in mind, that we can sometimes we know without being able to convince others. So, and to use Christianity as an example, holiness, the holy, or even divinity, Jesus, historical Jesus, the historicity of Jesus, I think it's not questioned, but whether he is really divine or according to the Torah, well, the Isaiah, or the Jewish tradition, whether he's the Messiah, Christ, and whether divinity is real. These would be called into question. But the sacred, if it's real, then for Christianity, that's holiness. And that dogmatism that permits knowledge without knowledge. We could have faith that we don't have extra, especially publicly accessible evidence to support, in order that the faith constituted knowledge. So, but then, of course, given that sometimes there are beliefs that turn out to be false, we might have pretended without us knowing that we've been pretending. And a sacred, if, as it turned out, that it's fictitious, without us being in a position to know that yet, then that illusoriness of the sacred, it's there are many religion practitioners. Among them, the doctrines are inconsistent. Various religion, Christianity and Buddhism, let's say, they are incompatible, because for Buddhism, I guess they don't believe in a creator, Yahweh. So that's one way in which most religions are incompatible. But holding that, calling that into question, putting them into brackets, we can still think about the ritual in Christianity, the Catholicism, liturgy, and how tradition are passed down and people get together, and how it's sustained. And there are things that are set up through convention. Of course, if it's through divination from God, then it's not merely conventional. But if we were to call that into question, then we can still understand that, and especially with regard to the sociality and the projection of significance when we interpret our experience with feelings, how others in a religious group will support each other emotionally. The sociality of religion, that's another thing that I think is very important, because, well, believers, whatever other people say, it feels it's very real. There's no, well, for them, for even if one doesn't have the proof that one knows, then they're not lying. So I think that's something very important. And when a group of believers get together and share their experience through sympathy, sometimes maybe some other people have some experience that someone doesn't have, someone else doesn't have, and they share the experience, maybe typically through testimony or sharing videos and maybe expressing their emotions through various artworks. And when one feel with the person having that experience, we learn to feel a certain way. So being brought up maybe in a Christian family, your parents, they pray, they go to church, and you saw them when they have the experience of singing hymns with a certain feeling, well, happy feeling, then that would have infected, let's say, the children being brought up, or they would have learned to feel a certain way instead of another, because to contrast that feeling with psychopathy, I think that's exactly when the psychopaths know the experience of someone else, but they feel in a different way, in a contrasting way, and learning to feel with the people in your group that and thereby sharing others, especially in happiness or suffering. That's I think one of the things that sustain some religion through sociality. So, and because I've talked about perhaps the sacred is fictitious, it's not real. So the feeling that we have towards, for Christians, towards Jesus and Yahweh and the Holy Spirit, maybe it's not real. And the feeling that Christians thought are significant would have turned out to be otherwise. Let's say someone with a certain supernatural disposition, and when a certain event happened, the experience that when they're present at the event, they would have interpreted the experience differently given their prior beliefs or presupposition. And it's like ideology, because given the certain way of upbringing, background beliefs, one would have interpreted something differently. Well, maybe back in the days when the science were not that advanced, some with maybe let's say during the book of Deuteronomy, there's an inclination to interpret illnesses as a punishment from God for sinning or doing wrong deeds, especially in violation of God's will. That disposition to interpret and the corresponding feeling that one would have cultivated different value system, and whether that value is real, whether when someone feels good towards a certain thing, whether that indicates anything of value, whether it's really good, and whether that feeling is as significant as one thought. The religiosity when one has when, let's say, singing hymns in the church, I suggest that the believers need not have proven the reality of the religion to have experienced that religiosity, and whether that feeling is really significant. it need not be settled in order that they experience their culture and religion, of course. So with that in mind, comprehension, how we are to comprehend people with different culture, especially different religion, and with particular episode of religious experience, how we understand, let's say to use the example of hysteria, if it were brought up, caused by some trauma, and let's say someone is brought up in a repressive religion, and certain icon would have been associated with certain figure of oppression, and the trauma and the icon, the relation, and how it explain the hysteria. It's not easy to understand if we were not if we don't believe in the religion that the person with the trauma believe in. And if we, as an agnosticism, we suppose, well, if the petitioner, or maybe even us, have a religion, have religious background, we can suppose away our religion and suppose with the person in question. And when we talk to the person, and when he or she share the experience, we feel with the person, especially if when they relive the experience, and you could feel them, given its trauma, the suffering, or if it could be a happy event as well, then we will be in a better position to understand emphatically the symbolicity of the religion, of the experience, of the trauma, of the hysteria, without having committed ourselves to the reality of their sacred. And the understanding is very important, of course, I think, because back many artwork has religion, or especially Christianity, as its subject. And I think that one way to understand humanism with regard to artwork, this is one way I would propose we can go on. First, naturality. There are things that measured along something almost only biological if we have a vitality conception of biology. Well, what's natural, it's what pertains to life and health, and even survival and reproduction, if evolutionary biology. But then humanity would be one way we are to understand artwork. But then sometimes nowadays, in this more secular age, the artworks are less often with religion as its a subject. So what about how are we to understand if that extra, especially if it is with a religious subject, then that extra beyond what's natural, that's human, but it's with a religion that we do not have to suppose it's, we do not have to believe in its reality. That, I think, is one way to think about supernaturality. And of course, the supernatural is usually understood in contrast to what's scientific. But I think from the perspective of value, we can also think about supernaturality this way. So here's a summary: explanation, causal versus rational, and construction. How even if what seems irrational because not based on fact, we can still understand that through its conventionality, how it's socially constructed, and of course, that social construction involve a projection of significance through our feeling, and there's a difference of whether the significance is real or not, depending on whether the sacred is real or not, without us having any sufficient proof that it is real. So, and that assists us in our comprehension, especially across religion and the corresponding religious experience, without having committed ourselves to the metaphysics of the corresponding religion. Thank you very much.